so much for all giving up some of your time this fairly wet and dreary Tuesday evening in January. I really appreciate you coming out to listen to predominantly our fantastic panel discussion, and if you'll put up with me just 10 minutes or so with me. For those of you that don't know, my name is Charlie Martin. I'm the CEO and founder of the Anti-Greenwash Charter. And in terms of structure for tonight's conversation, as I mentioned, I'm going to do 10 minutes or so just introducing a little bit about the work that we're doing at both the Anti-Greenwash Charter and truMRK, and then I'm going to hand over to Oli Parry, who will be conducting our rather expert panel we managed to pull together here tonight. At the end of that panel, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A for 10 minutes or so, and then afterwards we've got the room for an hour or so afterwards, so if anybody wants to sit behind and continue the conversation, then please do. So, to kick things off, and I know that we've got a number of marketing and communications people in the room here today, so I'm sure that this analogy will likely ring true for many of you. But the way that we have thought about the 21st century and the sort of conditions, if you like, in which we all communicate, is it's felt a little bit like the Wild West. We've had an absolute explosion in the amount of content being produced by both individuals and organisations, mainly supported or delivered by the rise of digital media and in particular social media. Now, that explosion in the amount of content that's being produced hasn't always married up with the quality of the communication standards that organisations have adopted. And this is really the kind of conditions that we find ourselves operating in here at the Anti-Greenwash Charter. In terms of what we do have, we know that we have regulations at play. Here in the UK, we have, for example, the Competition and Markets Authority's Green Claims Code. There are various other legal and regulatory frameworks that are doing their best. But from our perspective, the real problem with this is that it's, yes, telling us what we should do, and it's providing a real baseline for bad practice. But what it's not doing is giving us clarity around what leadership in terms of responsible communication actually looks like. Who are the people that are going above and beyond the norm in order to prove to you that they are responsible corporate communicators? And we think this is crucial because the opportunity at play now in the world that we live in is for those organisations that can prove once and for all and ongoing that they are taking the way that they communicate responsibly and are thinking about all of their stakeholders and the truth and trust that those organisations and individuals have in them. Now, I'm sure many of you have been watching Traitors over the course of the last few weeks, and of course it's a fantastic show. I won't, no spoilers, but these are the finalists. The thing that I think the show really highlights, obviously, is that there's a real a game of trust, if you like, going on within the game itself, and equally how that sort of manifests and relates to, well, really the crisis of trust going on in the world we live in. Trust in information and claims in comms more generally is at an all-time low, and we hear this all the time. Nobody trusts in anything that anybody says anymore. And this affects all stakeholders. It affects our consumers, our investors, our policymakers, and the wider public, and is a real issue of our time. Furthermore to that, you'll all know that we are living in a fairly interesting cultural existence as well, with obviously Trump's second term, the rise of things like fake news, terms like my truth, and essentially the rejection of anything notable as, or anything that relates to objectifiable truth and fact. And this is, again, part of the problem that we have, is that we found ourselves in a real mess when it comes to how we communicate and how we trust in one another's communications. And what's the implication of this? Trust is at an all-time low. Why does it matter? What impact does it really have? Well, from our perspective, looking at it from the Anti-Greenwash Charter's lens, if you like, when trust breaks down, confidence erodes. And if confidence erodes, then decision-making suffers. We make decisions slower. We make them with less of an informed and confident position. And as a result of that, progress as a whole slows. And some of the environmental and social issues that we really need to crack on and start addressing perhaps aren't done so as quickly as they otherwise would. And this is why responsible communication is such an important battleground we have got to find a way of collectively buying into a set of standards that we can all believe in and trust in. That's all the negative stuff. So now I want to think positive about the what if. What if we can get this right? And when we think about this, we think about the alternative of what I've just been through. We talk about how responsible communication in our minds could be an accelerator, a catalyst, if you like, for positive change, and ultimately allow us to propose progress, to understand innovation in a way that's understandable, supported, and scaled. And communication can be the oil, if you like, in the engine to help deliver that outcome. Now, you might have noticed on the previous slide mentioning that we have the stick in place in terms of regulation, and yes, there can be arguments about how well that regulation is implemented or upheld, but ultimately we have it in place. But what we feel we haven't had up until the point of creating the Anti-Greenwash Charter is a really clear carrot, an opportunity for organisations to prove their responsible marketing and communications credentials. And that's really what the Anti-Greenwash Charter is there to do. And how does it do it? Well, it ultimately is an organisation-wide public commitment to upholding key standards of marketing and communication practice, the very best standards. The way that it does this is by allowing organisations to conduct training, to conduct policy development and process and procedure implementation to ensure that as an organisation as a whole, they are embedding and integrating responsible comms best practice. The 4 principles or standards that all of our signatories aim to uphold are those that are mirrored from the Competition and Markets Authority's Green Claims Code and ultimately are the cornerstones and foundations of responsible comms. The impact of our work. So just to briefly describe to you some of the things that have happened as a result of organisations becoming signatories, the feedback that we've been getting, it really does all centre around an improvement in the internal conversations, the internal dialogue within organisations around how they communicate. It's all about producing clear governance, clear practice and procedure that allows the organisation to ultimately be confident when communicating about sustainability. And in a world where greenwashing is as much of an issue as greenwashing, that injection, if you like, of confidence within these teams is absolutely pivotal and critical if we're going to realise some of the points that I mentioned earlier about addressing some of the issues at play. But one of the things that we've realised while during our work with the Charter is that principles and public statements and commitments are simply not enough. Our signatories have asked us for more support. They've said, look, we need some more support on the granular level of checking our content before it's published to make sure that it's not greenwashing and that it's not misrepresenting us. And that has led to the development of our sister organisation, truMRK, which essentially is a verification service for individual pieces of content. And what we do is we essentially analyse content across 3 key areas. We look at the claims that have been made within the piece of content, making sure they're substantiated. We check the language that's been used in that piece of content to make sure it's aligned with the relevant regulation. And finally, we check the context. And this is crucial for omission-based misinformation, where essentially we're looking for what's not said in that particular piece of content and whether or not that full disclosure or lack of makes the piece of content misleading. From our perspective, we see these two as being very complementary, the Charter and truMRK providing a full holistic offering when it comes to responsible communication. The Charter at the organisational level, embedding in a cultural sense and a governance sense, responsible marketing and communication best practice, and truMRK offering that individual campaign by campaign verification that you have not fallen foul of any of those misinformation. Now, I've run out of time massively, so I'm going to rattle through this just to say that we have had clients that are now already working with us on both the Charter and now adopting truMRK principles as well, and this is kind of what we hope to see more of as we move forward, organisations adopting both. 5 minutes after I'm supposed to end, I'll pass over to Oli. Oli, thank you very much.
So, we have the essay question here. I think I want to start with Alastair, since we spoke this morning, so you have a slightly unfair advantage, but I'm going to exploit that. So, Alastair, you and I spoke about the industry as a whole, an industry that I'm very proud to be part of. But from a kind of a communications perspective, how important is responsible comms for a company's license to operate, in your opinion?
So I think it's really important, and going beyond the purely environmental or sustainability, I think that the public relations profession worldwide, under the umbrella of the Global Alliance, has been lobbying the UN to make responsible communications one of the new Sustainable Development Goals. Because in our view, if you don't have that, you can't really reliably account for anything else. So it's absolutely foundational. And so I think we have our members have a professional responsibility to ensure that their professional responsibilities go two ways. So they both communicate outwards on behalf of their organisation or their clients, but they also advise inwards. So the thing about responsible communications is partly about being accountable for what you publish in your organisation or your client's name. But it's also about helping and supporting it when we're talking about carrots, and warning clients and employers if they're about to make claims or to embark on something that you can see isn't responsible communication or doesn't, or is misleading, which would be a breach of our professional code of conduct, or isn't giving a true and fair picture of what the company's activities are. So it's as you said, foundational.
Great. And Lara, again, I know when we spoke last week, you had some pretty strong opinions about this. I mean, from your perspective at McCapra, what are you seeing from a licensed to operate perspective?
Yeah, I'm glad you said it's foundational, because I was a bit worried you were going to say that actually PR doesn't care about responsible comms, and I'm going to have to argue that responsible comms is really important to reporting, but thankfully you didn't. So I think, yes, I would totally echo what you say. I completely agree. It is very critical. I think it's quite an interesting moment we're in. We hear all these really doom and gloom headlines about everyone rolling back on ESG and DE&I in particular. We're seeing this sort of, everything feels so binary. It's everyone's either greenwashing or everyone's either greenhushing. And I think the reality is there's quite an interesting space in the middle that the majority of companies are actually quite credibly sitting in. And so I think in terms of the kind of general mood, I think we've certainly seen, gone are the days of big, bold ad campaigns or lofty net zero by 2050 targets with no backing. I think we've moved past that, and it's much more comms around business resilience and just doing the right thing and integrating sustainability into your risk register and actually genuinely taking action and thinking about governance of it too. So I think there's been that real shift in the last couple of years. And I think, it's 2026, a lot of companies are halfway through a 10-year strategy. We're seeing quite a refocusing of sustainability strategies happening too. I think Heineken was an interesting example that I noticed a month or two ago. They refocused their social sustainability strategy just to be much more focused on their material impacts. And I think actually that's sort of reflective of a kind of, I suppose, a greater humility that we're seeing in the space. Companies are much more happy to talk about shortcomings, talk about where things aren't really going to plan. This kind of language of work in progress we see from Patagonia, but we're sort of seeing it trickle down across others too. So yeah, I totally agree.
Saul, unpick that. With your industry and your various hats on, what's your perspective?
I'm glad you mentioned Patagonia, because it's a great example of a company that's telling it as it is, without exaggeration. In my sector, in construction, I think there's been a long game of trying to pretend that you're best in class, that you're leading the sector or you're aiming to, and you're doing all these wonderful things. And the global report goes out to the shareholders and others saying all the best things you're doing and forgetting all the bad things that you do. Just not mention that at all, the hushing of that. I don't think that's a point of difference anymore, because everyone's been doing that for so long. So I do think there's a refreshing twist towards the one that's the most honest being one that prevails, the one that's preferred. I have a sympathy with my partners and friends in construction. They've got to win their order book every year. The project's coming out to build the new whatever it is. Who do you pick? You pick the one that's best, or you pick the one that's the most honest, or the one that's cheapest, or the one that's got the best ideas of sustainability. It's difficult to know how we're going to be preferred. But I think honesty and authenticity are becoming more and more important, and I hope it stays that way. But if I'm really honest, if they're competing to win the next terminal at Heathrow Airport, then I don't think they should be playing at all. And that's difficult for me to say that, because my industry depends upon work and the need for growth, and the need to you can argue that they need to employ people, and need to grow their. Milton Friedman would tell us that their primary duty is to their shareholders, and that means winning more work and growing their turnover and making more profit. So to shift the paradigm on that whole narrative to what's where I think this room aspires to is one hell of a challenge.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next subject, I just want to ask the panel, do you feel that there is, I mean, clearly globally there is a watering down in a desire to promote a lot of this stuff. But within the UK, as the government struggles for growth, do you get the sense that there's less of a desire from a regulatory and policy perspective to promote sustainability?
The National Audit Office published a report last week on the relationship of regulation and growth, because and it's kind of interesting space to occupy. Because yes, the government's mantra is, it's all got to be about growth, and the National Audit Office talks about, and traditionally, other governments and other political parties, other political colours, have told us that the answer to growth is deregulation. And there are mixed views on whether that's worked or not. But I think the current government is very interested on the idea of a level playing field.
Yeah.
And if you give people certainty, and so if you think about sustainability and long-term planning, it doesn't help to have governments rushing in, slashing away at environmental regulations, and then suddenly people who've invested in a particular thing in the building sector, for example, find they've wasted their money because they might as well just not support it. It's much better to have a longer-term pipeline of work and a longer-term pipeline of expectations about what regulations are coming in and what impact they're expected to have. So I think that's an interesting question, and I think it may not be quite as straightforward as it's been traditionally presented.
Lara, I think you want to say something.
No, I mean, I think sort of similarly, we've certainly seen clients who are sort of almost waiting for regulation, and it's not really happening. So, the UK's sustainability reporting standards, we've been talking about that for years, and with hopefully next month we might get the next update, but it's a bit of a waiting game, and I think we've got a lot of clients, for example, who, there's some really great research that came out last year from Chapter Zero showing that boards genuinely really care about climate in particular, and 84% of boards see climate as mid to high priority, and that's higher in the UK. It was 94% in the UK. And so I think that's interesting as a backdrop, but then we've got a lot of clients who are producing transition plans, very aligned with boards, and they're not publishing it because the regulation's not there. And so it's a sort of interesting space where it's a bit of a kind of cat and mouse. No one, I had a conversation yesterday with a client, and this is the second conversation this month I've had with two totally different clients, and they said we want to be middle of the pack. And that's kind of the new ambition, I think.
Middle of the pack. Wow, okay.
Yeah, so really hard there. So I think one or two construction companies that are aiming to be best in the sector. That's again quite a low bar because it's not a particularly best professional sector. But at least they're able to be best rather than middle. That's pretty woeful. In terms of legislation, I won't bore you too much about construction, but there's a thing coming up called the Future Home Standard. So an upgrade on building regulations. It was going to be called Future Home Standard 2025, but I think we just missed it. Yeah. So maybe it's coming soon, and I think we're expecting a dilution from some of the ambition in it. So but one can expect that new homes will have air source heat pumps, will probably have some PV on the roof, probably will not have a battery, and have some slightly better insulation. So we're not aiming awfully high. And what we haven't touched is the materials. There was another quest to get what was called Part Z into the building regulations, and that was going to address embodied carbon. That would have promoted bio-based materials, building out timber or hemp and less concrete or brick or steel. Isn't that a really good idea? But it's not gone anywhere for the reasons you alluded to. There's a perception that it will cost more today, and that will slow the economy. And I think the quest for 1.5 million homes and the quest for growth was slightly out of Miliband's quest for net zero. So we haven't squared that yet, and I don't think we're going to anytime soon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there was, among Greenland discussion last week, the government did ditch a lot of regulations and propose bills as well, including reforming the Financial Reporting Council, which is the most unheard of but most important regulatory body for what we're talking about today. So moving on to the next question. So we've looked at, we're all agreed that it's important, there's diverging views on how important. Where does responsibility lie then for responsible communications? And Lara, perhaps I can start with you. So that's the first question, but the additional question is, how integrated is it in your experience within businesses? I appreciate that's a broad term, but maybe if you think about your client base.
So I mean, starting with where responsibility lies, I think that it kind of goes without saying, and I imagine everyone in the room agrees it's very shared.
Yeah.
I think everyone in an organisation at different teams has a role to play. I think it's been really great to see in the last few years and this is a regulatory driven thing, much greater collaboration between sustainability and finance teams, for example. That's really important, but also joint responsibility between marketing, comms, brand, all those different teams, legal, and having really clear approval processes in place when comms go out, making sure you've ticked all the right boxes so that you're not falling in any pitfalls of greenwashing. I personally spend quite a lot of my time digging around in annual reports. It's really a great place to be, would recommend. And what I find is really interesting when you're looking at annual reports is the number of clients or companies who it's really obvious when you get to a sustainability review and it is totally it comes out of nowhere. It's not integrated in the report. There's no other real integrated sustainability in the report. This is a client, a company has gone, oh, sustainability is important because, we've seen that a lot in Europe last year. CSRD means we need sustainability statements in the annual report, therefore I will put them in the annual report, and it's like, great, okay, job done. And actually, there is not that integration piece. And I similarly see that, play out across different channels too. So you often have a website and you think, what has that got? How do you get to this messaging when you've got something that's totally different in your sustainability report? And I think that inconsistency is where you start to get those problems. And that's where, you do risk greenwashing. So I think it's not a kind of, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that everyone's doing it really well. I do think there are some really nice examples at the same time that companies are getting it right.
That's brilliant. And Saul?
Yeah, I'll echo that about it should be all of us. I also recognise what you said about the sustainability report looking odd. But after you read through all the pages about the increase in the share price and the EBITDA and the margin and the cash generated, then you get the token page, you've got the SDGs on there. Tristan, you're sitting in front of me, you're celebrating them, and you've got planetary boundaries, and look, we know, we've done it, we've ticked it, we're okay now, good to go. And it's false, it's still there, it's superficial, and it's happening every day. Followed by some pages of doing something at school, fate, picking up the litter, and a little bit of blood on this. So the sick a lot, we should be in. Yeah, sad, isn't it? You would.
So I would say ultimately it's the responsibility of a board. That's what a board's for, or whatever, board of trustees, or how the organisation is constituted. And these issues that we're describing of the odd mismatch between what one bit of the organisation is saying or another voice from the organisation is saying arise from the fact that the board doesn't have an integrated view, hasn't really internalised this, doesn't talks about it. It's on the agenda as a 10 minutes before the end. Quick, let's it's and that's to do with who's on the board's culture about challenge and other things. And that's pretty much a sure sign that the sustainability report has been left to the comms team, and they're doing stuff as best they can to tack on to the kind of main corporate report. So there is a professional responsibility, obviously, from communicators to advise, to warn, and to communicate honestly without misleading. But I think ultimately it has to come from the top, and if it doesn't come from the top, as we described, it shows.
Very interesting. So if it is the responsibility, or in some cases, the sole responsibility of communications professionals, however you define that term, like group, to develop and to write and to work with agencies in order to design their own sustainability report. Where does the technical insight and the technical understanding come from? So, for those of you who don't know, I led Teneo's ESG practice for London, and the technical understanding when you're going toe to toe with the CSO, Chief Sustainability Officer, is up there. You really need to know your stuff. And I have to admit, I don't know if there's anyone from Teneo here in the room, but there were some meetings where I was definitely batting below par. My question is, how do comms professionals, if they have responsibility for this, get that level of understanding? And clearly there's a role for the CIPR, but Lara, and clearly there's a role for Emperor as well. But what are you seeing? Are you seeing a new comms professional that has that technical understanding, or are you seeing them working with, you know, the kind of research and development teams in order to gain that understanding? Because they can't just be left in a room to write a sustainability report. Or can they?
Who, board?
No, communications team, yeah.
Because I don't think you'd want boards sitting
No.
in the room writing a sustainability report. I think, yes, I think, you know, board training is really important here. Making sure that boards are up to speed on what's going on in the world of sustainability. I think we do see regulation as a really key driver of boards paying attention. And in particular, you know, the UK, we take, you know, a lot of our clients who are large UK listed businesses. TCFD has been on the agenda for quite a while, and so it's forced boards to sit up and pay attention because it's literally going into your strategic report. So that's been sort of something that has certainly put it on the agenda, and I think equally we've got a lot of AIM-listed business clients, and we've seen quite a significant drop-off in sustainability reporting by those businesses because the regulatory pressure is not there. And so I think, you know, it's an interesting moment, and I think boards certainly have a role to play, but in terms of that kind of training piece and engagement piece, you know, we sort of work with, it's for me, it's that combination of sustainability team, agency partner, comms team, board working together. We've got a sort of fair few implementation partners in particular that we work with who help us make sure that we're really getting the right messages across the board and that the right people are advising things.
Cool.
Well, I'm not big on comms, not big on the strategy of this, so I'll let the experts either side of me lead on that. But from a casual observation, all I would say is, isn't it disappointing that we have to brief the board on the subject? Wouldn't you hope that most people leading organisations in this country understand the issues by now? But it's partly a problem because they're being judged by their EBITDA number more than they are their Scope 3 emissions number. And I think that's part of the problem. We're perhaps measuring the wrong things still, which are based on short-term shareholder value, not long-term stakeholder survival.
I think that question about technical expertise is one that I'm very conscious of. So a lot of our members are interested in ESG reporting, but they're also very wary of it. We have some members who have decided to specialise in this and are very interested in it and gave good advice to me. Most, I think, are just dreading being asked to do something in this space because they're very conscious of their lack of technical knowledge and they wouldn't necessarily know where to go to. I mean, for me, we decided to start reporting our carbon footprint about 5 years ago, so we're quite new to this. Most of the tools that I could find asked me entirely irrelevant questions like what's the size of my vehicle fleet when we're a virtual organisation of 32 people. So I couldn't find any measurement tools that were terribly useful. And eventually found one called Future Tracker and worked with them to actually, we rewrote our expenses forms, for example, so that it captured data at source on things that would be useful, and then we hand them our annual accounts and they go and work out what the carbon footprint is. But honestly, if I didn't have them to do that for me, I don't know where I would get reliable figures from. So I think that's not just a sustainability issue for comms people. They're not experts in many things. They're not experts in EDI either. And you sort of reach this kind of threshold point where you think, oh, I'm getting into deep water here, and I'm not a specialist. And you know, people have to, and people make mistakes, and they get sometimes they get too far into something, so they will, in good faith, say something, not realising that that's not really properly well substantiated, and that's just you know, something they have to be conscious of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So obviously we talked about the board quite a bit. So, and I should say as well that the three non-execs that I have the most enjoyment working with are the ones that are open and willing to take advice. So people like Baroness Sarah Hogg, Lady Judge, Sir Win Bishop. And if they're willing to take advice and listen to the experts outside the room, then you often get a much more long-termist approach at the board level. But my question now really is, do they have a responsibility, board directors, to set the tone when we're talking about impactful sustainability comms? And I should say as well, and I know we talked about this last week, boards are sometimes, by their very nature, quite reactive. They're reacting to an event, an emerging regulation, a geopolitical event, and therefore their hands are often tied. And there was, of course, quite a bit of news last week about certain companies deliberately downplaying their approach to sustainability comms because of what is happening in the United States of America. So, to Lara, I know you sort of brought the boards a second ago, but should they do more to set the tone at the top when we're talking about sustainability strategy and communicating that strategy? Or is it more a case of taking that to the board via the committees, getting sign-off, and then carrying on? How involved should they be?
I mean, in an ideal world, yes, of course, they should, and it would be great to see boards of all companies, really driving that forward. I think pragmatically, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So I think it's more about that sort of interplay between boards definitely being brought in. I think you've mentioned regulations as a driver and impact in the States. It is undeniable that sustainability has gone down the agenda of boards, and so increasingly it is the responsibility again of sustainability teams to make sure it's back on the agenda and of finance to be really understanding it. And I think it comes back to what we said right at the start about that point of it's just good business and it's about business resilience, and we've seen a sort of shift in the way that sustainability is talked about and integrated to being something that's more integrated in what you're doing. We're looking at, funny enough, because I'm sitting next to you, I'm thinking of a client that we're working on at the moment in the construction sector. We've just been doing their value chain mapping, and a really important thing that regulation is driving is companies look at their impacts, risks and opportunities across their value chain. And that is something that is driven by regulation and sustainability teams, but actually that is really important for just the way the company is talking and the way that, and that is going in your annual report, it's going next to your business model. It's really, really important for boards and the way that your company is actually presenting itself. So I think it's, in an ideal world, it would be at the top of the agenda, driven by the board. I think in reality, you kind of probably have to meet them halfway.
And just before I move on to Saul, so it's no longer at the top of the agenda. Maybe it never was. I don't know if that. But what is above it then? If we're talking about a business, ostensibly is there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they are custodians of the business for a certain period of time to pass on to the next generation. They have both economic responsibilities and social responsibilities. So what would you say right now is probably above sustainability?
Well, I think this is where you come into exactly what you were just saying about the reactivity in short termism as opposed to long term. I think actually there was interesting news out of Nestle last week. Their CEO in an employee forum was talking about, he actually pretty overtly blamed Trump for them green hushing recently. And it was, I find that quite interesting when you look at it. He was basically saying, we're still staying the course, but because of the political rollback and the short-term view and geopolitics, we haven't been talking about it. And so, and he actually acknowledged, we're doing all these things, it's good business. I think the kind of, there was someone else who commented something about, ultimately we're doing, it's all about supply chain, it's all about regen ag, it's all about, sort of actually workers' rights, farmers' rights. It is totally aligned with what the US federal government is actually saying they should be doing, but you can't talk about it as sustainability anymore. Yeah, okay. So it's that kind of long-term and short-term thing I think we've got.
So it's green hushing. So, I know I keep saying you've got a huge sector to represent here, but looking at it, I mean, should boards be doing more?
Do you think it's important that sort of what we measure and what we think is important. I also think it's really important that we don't just think about what's happening in America right now and the Trump rhetoric and how that could have an impact on us. If we're too down on our current government and where it's going and what the prospects are, I think we know what's coming next. And we could see a replica of that in this country.
Yeah.
And I think if we think there's been a bit of an impact because America sneezed and we caught a cold, what would happen if we had a far-right populist government right now doing all the same things and legislating?
Yeah, absolutely. Alastair, maybe you could also talk about what you're seeing at the board of CIPR. Quite interesting.
There was pressure is probably too strong a word, but there was a strong interest in sustainability reporting. We for a number of years we followed the integrated reporting principles, but then we stopped because we just thought it's just too much of a faff really, and it's not been doing us any good. So we stopped. But there was broad interest in sustainability reporting and doing some of the basics, because we were encouraging our members essentially to model what we were encouraging our members to do. But that has really tailed off. And the big thing for us is about EDI. So we are the only professional body in the UK that holds the national equality standard. And there's been a lot of rowing back on EDI, and our board is very bullish about that. They're saying, we are not rowing back on it. We are reapplying for accreditation this year, and we don't care who is in power in America. I mean, we can afford not to care because we haven't got the Americans, big American contracts or customers. But we are absolutely sticking by that, and we're public about it. But sustainability has dropped down the interest level, and I think, but there is a lot of interest in governance internally, and how we make decisions, how we're accountable for decisions, and I think that's mirrored in a lot of other organisations as well. Not just business as usual, and we thought this would be okay, but what are you doing? Why are you doing it this way? Where's the paper trail? And my own, to veer off the question a bit, my own personal view, not the view of my organisation. It's very interesting that the Anti-Greenwash Charter has an audit tool that goes with it, so you can check. And we in public relations, we always talk about restoring trust, which would be lovely. That's a great aspiration. But I think we maybe ought to prepare ourselves for a ultra low trust future, in which essentially, if you can't prove it, I mean, it's interesting. We love talking about trust. Nobody would take financial reports on trust. That you're audited, and you're audited because you can't be trusted, and that's just normal, right? So nobody would say, well, let's just believe that this is this is the value of their share, this is how much money they make. Nobody would accept that. We absolutely require that to be audited by an independent third party, and if there's any suspicion that it's not being done independently or they haven't done their job properly, it's held to pay. Yet we don't apply that standard to other things. And maybe we're moving into a world in which people say, do you know what, show me the audit, show me who trusted independent third party came in and demonstrated that you were doing these things. And that may not be a bad thing. But that's not a trust society, that's a very low trust society. But I would argue that not trusting people on their finances hasn't done us any harm.
And I should say, I think when you're talking about audit, you're talking about the assurance process, aren't you?
Yes.
So the assurance process for sustainability claims. Which is another topic which maybe we could touch upon.
I might just add one thing on the point of your lack of trust. There's so little trust that we even have to, the new standards that recently came out that are audit standards, so that we can make sure that we're actually trusting what the auditors are doing. Trust them.
Right.
Can I just quickly add something to that that's relating to audit, again back to construction? I'm sorry I'm not going to ISG was a big, large construction company doing some very big jobs in the UK when they went bust 12 months or so ago. It now looks like their supply chain 1 billion. Oof. The balance sheet that had been signed off a few months beforehand by a very reputable auditor didn't suggest that. Go back a few years, you'll find trillion. The numbers are much worse than that. So getting the audit right is really important, and if you can't get it right, then why bother?
Yeah, indeed. So, thank you very much. I think I'd like to open to any questions in the audience. The gentleman at the front.
But do I need a microphone?
No, we can hear you.
Ah, okay. I'm Tristan Olivier, Chief Viability Officer at the Institute of Specialist Surveyors and Engineers. If Alastair is a self-professed minnow, that must make Saul a whale. I would absolutely cast Lara as the mermaid, which makes me a proud phytoplankton. And I say that partially in jest in reality.
Metaphor murder.
Because phytoplankton manufacture half of the oxygen we breathe. Life and death happens at the cellular level. We all know what those look like. We are in the metacrisis, and not the mito crisis, and I'm referring to mitochondria. But I think if truth-telling is what we need to be focusing on, then even a shift in the language from sustainability, even though it's taken us a while to get most people to recognise and become familiar with that terminology, viability surely is the next step, but actually succession, the generational longevity across all ecosystems has to be the true message that we're, or direction that we're in, and to what extent and how do you think we can actually start to push even further sort of ahead with that, that light?
I'll go first only because I'm looking right at you and it's very intimidating. I think part of the problem is that the long-term succession plan works really well in a family business where we're thinking of the generational transfer of the asset and constant continuity. And in an organisation like the Charter Institute of Building, where we've got a world charter and we're going for almost 200 years, you do take that approach. If you own your shares in a PLC today, you can flip them to somebody else tomorrow. So if that company's not generating the return you want and the share price isn't going up as quickly as you want, sell, go to them instead. So I think the short-term nature is going to prevail for as long as the capitalist regime prevails and you don't value or cost the externalities in the way that we should. Yeah, sorry. I'm quite eloquent for a while.
Chap in the pink shirt.
Hey, Josh from Cambridge Social Impact Consulting. It's a question based on a problem the Welsh Government's currently having in trying to ban political lying and working out exactly where the line is from the kind of overt, deliberate lies to what might be a creative interpretation set of language. And what I'm interested in is when it comes to kind of ambitiously projecting the future and making promises and targets. How would you go about communicating ambition right now in that low trust environment? I'm specifically thinking of that ambition where you know you're not going to make it, but you might get a downside closer if you aim for that ambition, as well as what happens when you obviously have to then readjust the targets as you get closer and realise, yeah, we're not going to hit it.
No, that's a great question. Lara, do you want to go with that first?
Yeah, I think, if you just look around, a lot of companies are in exactly that position, and we're seeing that, I think I mentioned earlier, that kind of recalibration of sustainability strategies at the moment, and that humility and being able to accept when things aren't going quite to plan. I think to give an example, Microsoft, for example, I think it was 5 to 6 years ago maybe, they announced that they were one of the first ones, big leading, we want to be carbon negative pledge. And actually in recent years, AI has meant their emissions have done the absolute opposite and they've increased. But interestingly, if you actually look at their comms, they are being quite open about that. And so I think in terms of trust, consumers and all audiences, employees, everyone wants to see actually just incremental progress and just much. I think it's this shift to sort of much more tangible progress, and it's that kind of from X to Y rather than some point in the future kick the can down the road. It's the kind of much more step-by-step progress, and that's certainly, I think, the people who are doing it right, the companies doing it right.
Transition planning, basically.
Transition planning is obviously is a perfect example.
Alastair?
I mean, there may be a cultural change at work here. it's possible that there was a generation of people who were motivated by big picture, bold claims. We're going to, you know, sort of like the moonshot Kennedy talked about, we're going to put a man on the moon by 1970. That made a lot of things happen, which, you know, many of them might happen, and they might still have achieved getting a man on the moon anyway. But that was kind of the kind of textbook example of they had no idea how they were going to do it, but they were just going to keep throwing money at it until they could make it work. There are fewer and fewer problems in the world today that feel that they're amenable to that kind of approach, and I think people do appreciate humility more, and they appreciate realism, and they don't expect you to change the world, and they don't expect you to, you know, to do necessarily, and they want you to do your best. They want you to do something decent, and not make silly claims, and then that's kind of enough for them. So that's I think we're all living in a time of reduced expectations. And that's you know, maybe we just have to express ourselves in line with that. And I mean, personally, I've always hated targets because I just think you've got no idea. Like in line with what we were saying about AI, it's easy to make a linear projection 5 years into the future. Who knows what's going to happen? So just do your best. Talk about that. Talk about what worked, what didn't work, and that, I mean, hopefully, will just be enough for most people.
And I'd probably just add something on the verification point as well, which is, I think, we mustn't lose sight of the importance of external verification for things like that. So, you know, SBTI, new standards coming out, 2.0 standards, like things like that are actually really important as well, to making sure you're saying, look, these are the incremental changes we made, but we're actually externally validated, and it's not just a kind of shot in the dark.
Yeah. Sorry, the lady in the second row with the knee.
Stretch.
No questions any further back in the second row.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Ryan. I'm an independent consultant formerly of Bloomberg News. I'm very curious to go back to this point about keeping sustainability on the agenda, and the point about Nestle I think is really curious, because one thing that I know is becoming more and more important is the importance of adaptation to the global warming that we've already had. And it's particularly crucial for a company like Nestle. They've got to think about, are their cocoa farms going to be around in the next 10 years, that sort of thing. So I wonder if any of you have had any experience dealing with companies or dealing with boards who are very aware of the importance of adaptation and sort of saying to them, well, there's another side to the adaptation coin, and maybe that's a way of keeping the sustainability flame alive.
Any of my friends want that? Well, I'll just do a quick construction bit first. I don't know too much about Nestle's predicament, but I can imagine. I think it's really hard to predict what sort of future we're adapting to and the resilience that we want. I don't know if we're looking at a 40-degree, 50-degree UK summer, or we're looking at a minus 30-degree UK winter, or maybe both, in an ANOC situation. I think it's really hard to. If I was gambling and looking at all adaptation, I'm not going to do it. I just think we have to put mitigation first, and we have to produce and make it tolerable, make it possible, plausible, because I don't think we can possibly build resilience for the future that's otherwise coming. And I almost worry that the discussion about that allows you to think that we haven't got to worry too much about mitigation, because we're going to adapt anyway. We're clever, we're humans, we're adaptable, we're great tech. We'll find a solution. It might be geoengineering, it might be quite risky, but what the hell, they're right.
Carbon capture and storage.
What's wrong with that? I mean, trees, yes. Beyond that, I worry. So, a great question, and I don't mean to belittle it because it's fantastic. I just worry about it. I worry that we can possibly have resilience to a future that's so unfathomable, unlivable, that it's hard to predict what you do to. Will it last 5 years, or will it give us an extra 10? Let's not get that. That's my primary view.
I won't name any names, but we did a double materiality assessment for a large frozen food business, a global frozen food business, and so obviously it's a really, really important thing for them. But I think for me it really highlighted that understanding your impacts, risks, and opportunities, and you know the wonder of a DMA is that there's double materiality assessment. It forces you to look sort of inside out and outside in. So it's really helping you to understand the impact that your business has. And I think for me, those kind of exercises in many parts driven by regulation are really, really key into sort of starting that board conversation in particular. So, thinking about the kind of likelihood of what may happen and the severity of what may happen and what may not happen in different time horizons, and setting thresholds and genuinely monitoring thresholds around against it, I think is really key.
Any more questions? Gentleman down from there.
Okay, I'm Maurizio Caturi from the Centre of Research and Transition, and I also work for the University of Hertfordshire. And my question cuts across who is responsible for communications, and also where is it, what is on top of sustainability, as it were, and also I want to touch on AI as well. So I see that in universities, the CIPR, which is the principle of responsible education, management education, there is a little bit when they're interested in sustainability. So we teach you less. I think there is the issue of perhaps then future managers, I would say, or future directors that end up in the industry, they are not sensitized to sustainability. And I'm really, really surprised to see how much communication there is between education and business. The other aspect is that in the universities at the moment, we seem to think about AI in terms of the cells. Basically we're saying, okay, we develop the tools, if it sells, we develop it. And then really the attention is all there. So I wonder whether that's also happening in boards. So in other words, in a board, instead of thinking about sustainability, that's what on top with. People start to say, oh, how do we deal with AI? How do we have next AI?
Yeah, I would say, to my knowledge, yes. Everybody's expected to have something to say about AI in the way that 10 years ago they were expected to have something to say about sustainability. Everybody wants a strategy. Why? What they want a strategy for? Where they want it, who knows, but they want one. I mean, it's interesting that there's increasing concern coming out now that people have cut their workforces in some sectors quite substantially in order to invest in AI in the belief that that will all be to the good, and it's not going well for them at all. I don't have that particular pressure from my board, but I'm conscious that it is something that's very live. That's the big thing that everyone thinks they've got to pay attention to and get to grips with. And I would say that there's also been a bit of a slow, 2022, 23, everyone was terrified of being left behind. Now people aren't so worried about being left behind. There's thinking, let someone else go down the line first. And somebody said, we want to be middle of the pack. Middle of the pack. We want to be middle of the pack. We don't get left behind. We're not rushing ahead. Let's see how everyone else does, and we'll figure it out based on their experience.
And just to build on your point on AI as well, I think we're certainly seeing a shift in companies actually recognising AI as a stakeholder too. And so I think when we go back to the conversation we were having earlier about responsible comms and consistency across channels, there's a really great stat that I came across recently, which was that AI is 2.3 times more likely to read what's on your website before it reads a report, before it actually goes to a PDF in terms of scraping that data. So, it's that, again, it goes to that point of actually it's making you have to sit up and go, oh, are our comms actually consistent across all our channels, and what's on our website genuinely matters in a way that potentially
I'll just mention, it doesn't say anywhere on our website, but so I have 32 staff. According to Microsoft Copilot, I have 102, which is, that's good, that's the impression we like to give, but it's entirely wrong.
Gentleman on the third row.
Just on about responsible communications, you mentioned a lot about boards. Most, when you talk about Nestle and construction industry, most of the scope 3s, SMEs, and small business owners fly. When you speak to purchasing managers, they are very much targeted on price and buying from cheapest first, and often, but not only don't know the sustainability targets that their company has, they're definitely not passing on to their SMEs and supply chains, but really small businesses, construction, whatever. It is mainly easy.
Yeah, no, I've read that one.
Where's the responsibility lie in going through? Because
that's the mismatch, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I alluded to earlier that I still think EBITDA is a driving metric for most businesses. generating that profit comes from buying more cheaply and reducing your costs. So you're quite right, those purchase managers are out there to try and buy the product at the cheapest price. And right now you can buy brand new steel from a country overseas, you might guess who, which may have been in a furnace with emitting lots of CO2. It doesn't register in our national numbers at all, so it doesn't really care from a national perspective. It's cheaper, and therefore it will help the EBITDA. But the alternative products are recycled steel that you could have used for a different building. It's costing more. It's ironic that there's almost another moral dilemma. An ethic. If you're wealthy enough, you can buy the most sustainable product, and that's. I'm not sure that sits in my moral compass. That there's almost an option to pay more to do that, to get the right outcomes, to put it into your report and say, didn't we do well? But not everyone can afford to do that, and that's an issue.
One last question. For me on the supply chain, sustainability is becoming elitist for businesses. I think the small businesses not targeted on it. They don't understand it. They can't afford special.
Yeah, they don't.
Construction is a classic example of that. It's
if you take the biggest construction companies, the tier ones, the big numbers, that purchasing that's being done from that small and medium-sized enterprise is still a scope 3 direct emission of the tier 1 company. It's their emission, they've got to count it. Right now, scope 3 emissions for a construction company is about 99% of all their emissions. So they'll talk about they've electrified the head office, they've got the company cars shifted, they've recycled their waste, they've done this. All they've done is play with the 1%. The 99% is the concrete, the steel, the bricks, the locks, the stuff that actually is just an enormous part of their mix. And the board is saying, let's get turnover up this year. Let's drive the revenue. Let's get more work, which is just going to increase the scope 3 because there's little being done in innovation to reduce it. So we've got a complete mismatch with the growth agenda, excess consumption, give us completely wrong outcomes.
I think we've got time for one more question, but just with scope 3 emissions, a really interesting case study is Dow Plastics or Dow Chemicals. So if you have time, go away and take a look at how they're approaching scope 3. Yeah, the lady in the third row with the blue sweater.
Hi, independent verification body. Just wanted to echo what you were saying, Lara, about the importance of verification, especially as some businesses are still self-reporting, barking their own homework. Just wanted to get the opinion of the panel on the changes, like for example, BPOP's version 7 is now requiring independent verification. The new EU ECGT coming out in September, basically any organisations looking to provide services or products in the EU in September have got to have their claims verified. Just wondered what your feedback is, your views on how that's going to impact on responsible communications.
Lara, why don't you go first on this?
Oh, I wish I could say I was a verifications expert. I sadly can't. But in terms of how it affects responsible communications, I mean, if I take reporting, extrapolate that out to reporting, for example, we've seen CSRD is encouraging companies, it requires certain levels of assurance in audit as well. And that I think has been a good thing because it's made companies actually have to get genuine data and find it that they never even thought about finding before, and sort of get those internal systems in place. And I think they then have that data and they can use it, and we are constantly encouraging our clients, if you're going through all this, the pain of pulling a report together, you should use that to then, that is your Bible, and you should use that, and it's been audited. That is sort of tools for broader communications, and so hopefully that's something that we'll start to see more, that you get companies that almost have that kind of license to go and reuse that information and take it elsewhere. That's what I would hope to see.
I was not going to ask you a question at all. Can I ask you a question? Being a B Corp, how many in the room are B Corps? Okay, not that many, but how many have worked with B Corps or promoted? Many not. And how many went to the National Emergency Briefing? Quite a few. How many watched it since on social media or caught up with it? Not many. I really recommend we all did that too. You'll find it. National Emergency Briefing, really good. And B Corps, my little consultancy is B Corp. I just find the whole process so difficult, it's so hard, it's so demanding. I think it's great what they're doing, and I'm really proud to be one, but oh my word, it's tough. And I don't know if it's almost too tough, because it puts people off. It makes it too hard to try and be good. There's a real danger that quest for perfection is somehow the enemy of good.
Alastair?
I'm always in favour of verification. More audits good, more audits and auditors even better. I have been thinking recently about what, and we've talked a little bit about AI. One of the things I've heard a lot of recently is that people are reluctant to invest in AI because of the environmental impact it has. But the environmental impact it has seems to me, in my relative ignorance, to be very contested. And there is a lot written about the amount of water that is used. I don't know how much water AI is used, but it seems to me that if you're trying to verify things, that's a major area of uncertainty. And depending on what measures you use or what tools you may use, or whatever, you may get very, very different answers. So, and I'm sure that applies to a degree to other things. So we're about 95% scope 3 emissions. And I think because most of that is in our supply chain, I mean, that's difficult to verify. You know, it's assumptions based on what we've reported about our activity and how many computers we run and that kind of thing. But you know, we could be wrong by quite a large factor. So I think I'm all in favour of hard evidence. That needs to be tempered with an understanding that, especially in some of these new areas, we don't really have a solid and reliable picture.
Thank you very much. We are monstrally over time, so unfortunately we can't take any more questions. But I just want to sort of sum up before we move on. What has been quite astonishing about today's panel is we're talking about a lot of things that we were talking about 14 years ago. And I just want to throw some phrases your way. Short-termism versus long-termism. We were having this debate when Vince Cable was Secretary of State for Business, and yet it seems to be emerging yet again. Governance, corporate governance. It's warmed my heart, I must admit, that the corporate governance, good governance being foundational is being discussed, because it's kind of been forgotten over the last 4 or 5 years, and yet it is returning. More on that in a second. And then the debate around assurance and audit for sustainability claims, which is another debate for those of you trying to follow the narrative on this, which has been going on for at least 10 years. And I know that the Big Four are very keen, of course, that assurance becomes compulsory, but this debate will continue for quite some time. And I think, if you think about where we were 10 years ago, pre-Carillion, pre the collapse of British Home Stores and everything that's come since, I do wonder exactly what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And on corporate governance, I shared it with my colleagues on the panel this morning. There was a brilliant article published by Bloomberg last week, on the 20th of January, to do with governance and how important, and in their assessment, having spoken to a number of investors this year, corporate governance will be the key theme going forward. So I would urge you all to either contact me and I'll send you the link, or just Google Bloomberg corporate governance and I'm sure you'll find it. All that is left for me to do is thank our amazing panel. Over time, but it's definitely been worth it. And I will continue for another half an hour. My kids are not asleep, so I will be absolutely keen to carry on for a bit longer. But that may cause long-termism issues at my house. And I also want to thank Charlie and everyone who's been involved in putting this together.